to the first in this series. This is quite a special lecture series, but because it's on a phenomenally important topic. It's also the first time we've all been together in person for our public lectures in more than 2 years, which is really exciting that we can have in person and online. I hope many of you can stay and have our drinks reception after, which is always a really nice bit to debrief after the lecture and everything. My name is Susan James Relly. I'm a Professor in Vocational Education here at the department. We started to organise this lecture series early in the summer when Sally approached Victoria Murphy, the director of the department. And at the time I was the deputy director of the department, hence getting involved in this through my role as chair of the EVB committee. And we thought, what a great topic this would be, to have a series of lectures that run throughout the term for the seven weeks, to really try and, not just have a superficial look at this, like spend 7 weeks dissecting the topic and looking at it from a whole variety of different angles with external speakers and internal speakers. And so hopefully if you're here tonight, you've seen the titles of the other 7 that you'll be able to join us. We culminate with another panel at the end, which is going to be really exciting. But as I said earlier, this is just such a fundamentally important topic that we need to be looking at in a Department of Education. And we have colleagues who've been doing this for a long time. Steve Strand, in his research on race and education, has been looking at this for 20 years, and he's going to be giving a follow-up lecture in Hillary term on this topic. And so we have a number of colleagues involved in this area, but it's the first time that we've brought everyone together in a lecture series, and I think we're going to hear some really fascinating insights and some research that will get us all thinking. I'm going to stop talking now, and so we can get into the meat of it. And I'm going to hand over to Jason, who is chairing and presenting in today's session. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Susan. I'm going to sort of go straight into it. Although my wife said, "Don't go like a train." I said, well, it depends what train you're talking about. Is it one that's delayed, or is it one that's not a bus service? I'm going to be more like a bus service than a sort of big, bold train. So, I've got the technology. Okay. So I'm going to say a few words in a moment about how we might think about the terms that we've got in our title, Imperial Legacies, Race and Education. So I'm going to talk about those sort of 3 terms in a moment, before then sharing with you some new research projects that I've been involved in that relate to a range of sort of initiatives that I've been involved in that trying to support teachers with their teaching with regard to empire migration blogging. I'm aware that some colleagues have probably heard that stuff, so I've done some new stuff for you at the beginning, and then the sort of the teacher education stuff will come in a bit later. But actually, what I want to start with is actually a film that I made with a range of different people, but included young people from across the world. So some young people in South Africa, some people in the UK, New Zealand, and all different places. And the film was called Silences, Traces, Voices, Conversations and Journeys Through Race. And so some sort of context, and this was for the School's History Project. It was a plenary for the School's History Project. And the film that I made, which is 1 hour, 40 minutes, so I'm not going to show it to you tonight, was deliberately multivocal to disrupt the authority of my single perspective, which I think is really critical to these conversations that we're having. And I want to share a clip that was made by school-age students responding to the request I made, which is in the bold there. Tell us about how you think race is silenced, but also where you find traces of it and voices related to it. And like I say, we had submissions from South Africa, New Zealand, and UK sort of contexts. Now, the idea of silence is just to set up a little bit of context of why these terms matter. The idea of silence draws on the work of the Haitian scholar Michel Rove-Trier. In his book, Silencing the Past, he analyses how certain aspects, events, and stories of the past are silenced, and what these silences reveal about power relations, both in the past, but also in the present. The idea of traces draws on the idea that while attempts have been made to silence or suppress those stories, traces of them remain within politics and within our lives and things like that. And this idea is kind of based on psychoanalysis, where traumatic or difficult memories or histories are repressed or buried, but the traces of them remain. And that's kind of contained in that second quote by Freud to his friend William Weiss. Some impression of the event must have been left inside of me. Where is it now? And it kind of points to the sort of elusiveness sometimes of our discussions around race as well, both those terms of silencers and traces. And historians like Bill Schwartz, which is the second book there, in White Man's World, they've argued that societies need to identify and confront these traces. And without doing that, they will continue to haunt the present like a ghost. And this haunting is an issue that impacts on all people, regardless of their racial backgrounds. And the Black American writer and activist, James Baldwin, makes this clear in his book, The Fire Next Time, that was published in 1963. And you can see there in quote 3, he talks about how unless we confront this, we're trapped by that history, we're trapped by that sort of, that narrative. So I just wanted to sort of set that up in terms of it, by way of introducing this student, who is a local student, Toby. And let me hope that this transition works seamlessly. Where are you, film? There's only a couple of clips, but yeah, it's just 2 minutes, but I just think it's really important that we hear this voice.
Having grown up in a predominantly white country and living in what is arguably one of the most stereotypically and historically English cities of England, it is clear to me that those unaffected cannot accurately discern the effects of what is essentially racism by omission. That is, racism perpetuated through silence. The problem, in my opinion, does not lie in the fact that our history education seems to be centered on colonizers and xenophobes, as I believe learning about our past, our monarchs and politicians in relation to the context of today, taking care not to revere those undeserving, is vital to ensure both a cohesive and collective understanding of where we must not go in the future and an appreciation for the position we stand in. The problem lies in the fact that when I, a South Asian person of color at the age of 9, asked my teacher the question, well, what about the people who looked like me, amidst a discussion of World War II, I was met simply with an, I don't know. There were no fingers pointing me towards someone who would, no offer to find out. The systematic nature of racism was proven to me then through the fact that the only history deemed necessary to teach to a classroom which held both black and brown students as well as white ones was white history. It showed me at 9 years old that I was not included amongst the children our education was supposed to be catered towards. We would learn of the British stiff upper lip, of Elizabeth and Mary in the Cold War. We would walk past monuments to roads and, yes, discuss the heinous atrocities of concentration camps, the abhorrent prevalence of violence during apartheid, but as if it was something from a bygone era, an era in which black people and people of color existed in a manner worthy enough to learn of, yes, but only if they were painted as victims.
What this forceful exposition offers me.
I forgot that I was going to come in a bit later. Okay, and I will sort of, I'm just going to get my water. So partly I just wanted to start with the learner. I wanted to start with young people. And I think that this and all the videos that I got from the young people that I asked, it kind of highlights how important it is for us as educators to talk with our students, with implications for the pedagogies that we adopt in our classrooms and in our seminar rooms. She highlights the need, she demands the need that actually we confront and talk about these issues. And it's a recognition that much of the changes and demands for a diverse or decolonial curriculum have themselves been driven by young people. And we're responding to that. And I think that's a really critical recognition. She argues that the absences themselves are a form of denial, a disavowal that serves the racializing narrative. It also highlights that while, as I'll argue later, we need to think about the complexity at stake cognitively and what it means to understand some of these terms, students' affective needs are important, especially in relation to issues of representation and how that representation is framed. So now I'm going to sort of turn to some of the terms that are in our title and that we're exploring in this series, Imperial Legacies, Race and Education. Putting legacies into inverted commas is quite deliberate. Back in 2003, the historian Linda Coley wrote an op-ed responding to Niall Ferguson's work on empire, condemning a balance sheet approach to the writing and the teaching of empire, due to the fact that some of the versions of those imperial formations are still with us today, with race and racism being one particular example. What Coley is drawing our attention to is the complex interplay between past and present, And Stoller takes this further when she's concerned that legacies hold too tightly into a moment, offering a ready-made synthesis that might serve to limit analysis. That legacies might suggest that these histories have been rendered as leftovers, legacies of a dead past, rather than active forces in the world today. She offers the idea of duress, that is neither a thing or an organizing principle, but a description of a relationship to a condition that perhaps better connects those colonial histories with the present, to help reveal the uneven and sustaining processes and, crucially, the dynamic relationship we have to these pasts, mediated across various different temporal and spatial contexts. You'll probably find that all the terms need inverted commas, but I'm going to turn to education now. So what of education and universities like Oxford? Sarah Stockwell's work in the British Empire makes a significant contribution to the idea of complicated but sustaining imperial processes through her considerations of 4 British institutions in the post-war decades: the Bank of England, the Royal Mint, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The book ranges from the 50s to the 80s, showing how colonial structures and legacies within these institutions, all 4 of them, within these institutions shifted from merely imperial hangovers to distinctly new engagements over time. Stockwell charts how Oxford and Cambridge trained colonial administrators in newly independent countries, arguing that this is a constituent part of the decolonizing process. Stockwell shows the ability of institutions and individuals within those institutions to use, she uses the word opportunities offered by decolonization. She also points out the influence was not unidirectional, and that university syllabi, particularly development studies, were influenced in turn by African decolonization. Nevertheless, her account also demonstrates how many of these structures and legacies continued to be shaped by imperial assumptions, worldviews, and power relations deep into the 20th century. Her work forces a recognition of the process of decolonizations involves much, much more than constitutional change in governance in a former colony. It had an impact here on institutions like Oxford University and the individuals that work within that university. It invites us to examine universities' role, forcing difficult questions about universities' interest in motivations in providing courses for some of these colonial subjects. The Department of Education's history is a relatively new one, so this is what I'm talking about is here as a constituent part of the university, and it's quite new compared to the collegiate university, and work remains to be done in exploring the legacies here in the department. However, a quick look at the register of diplomas going back to 1898 quickly reveals that this department has got a long history of colonial links. One example is Giles Ireton Elliott, who matriculated in 1901. He was born in South Australia, and he was a teacher at Melbourne Grammar. His grandfather, who's pictured there on the left, William Giles, was manager of the South Australian Company. This was set up in 1835 to facilitate the purchase of land in South Australia, wealth that presumably funded his grandson's studies here in Oxford. Many of these original land purchases, land already inhabited, was enabled by the British government's decision to also compensate former slave owners in the Caribbean following the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. So quite a messy sort of set of relationships. A contrasting example is Florence Mahoney, here pictured in the middle. Born in Gambia, she obtained a postgraduate degree in education in 1952. She goes on to establish with others the National Museum in Banjul in 1973, as well as writing a number of books on Gambian history and giving lie to the controversial idea of the Oxford Regis history professor Hugh Trevor Roper that Africa has no history. These acts of recovery are important, and we now see lots of attempts to recognise and herald the work of Black scholars. What's interesting, perhaps, by the university, is how this work might serve to hide a range of other people of colour working at other levels in the university, like cleaners or porters, and they're not celebrated. We might ask questions about how and why different groups get represented to guard against self-congratulation. What these stories show, all of these stories here, and I could pick up loads of others as well, is the complicated networks and relationships that are the legacies of the durabilities of an empire played out in multiple ways. The task of exploring imperial legacies in education as a discipline is impacted in the histories I've just talked about, but understanding it is more complicated given the wide-ranging nature of the field of education. John Furlong charts the inherent complexity of the discipline founded on four others: philosophy, history, sociology, and psychology. All have their imperial antecedents. Unraveling this Gordian knot is further complicated by different origins and locations of the education discipline, whether in universities like us, further education, or skits that are sort of appearing all over the place in this country. Each location is subject to different values, different sources of funding, and different types of control. Furlong argues that education's presence as a discipline, and possibly also our presence as a department in a university, is an ambivalent one, forced to reconcile key tensions between theory and practice, which we're familiar with as teachers, educators, but also between global outlook and one that considers the local context, the partnership of schools that we work with. These tensions are familiar in discourses around decolonisation, in which accusations might be made about the avoidance of tackling material legacies of colonialism that are evident in relation to students' admissions or staffing, or student feelings of belonging. They're admitted, but once they're here, they don't feel like they belong here, even while engaging with theory related to fields of decolonisation. But also where the global stance can also serve to hide how race, class, and locality can intersect and serve to exclude local Black British students from access and participation to elite universities. The final tension here is how the work in relation to imperial legacies, race, and education gets done, as it involves risk. How we research it, how we teach it, and how we study it. My undergraduate experience as a cultural studies student was at the Polytechnic of East London. It wasn't simply the content of the course that took risks, but the admissions. I had no A-levels. I wouldn't have got into this university on that basis, not just about my race. The forms of assessment that we did, we recorded tapes, we made films. The ways of teaching, the collaborative approaches to research that enabled a usually educationally marginalised group of people to discuss issues of imperial legacies and race, but also to thrive as human beings. So I think there's a much bigger set of questions that we have to ask, rather than simply thinking about who are the scholars that we're including in our reading lists. Doing this sort of research and teaching entails running risks, made harder, in the context of populist press, and the case of initial teacher education, potentially a hostile government. But thought needs to be given about how risk does not fall disproportionately on individuals, especially individuals from racially minoritized backgrounds, to consider how a typically cautious institution like Oxford University might enable risk. This is not the same as managing risk, where the primary concern is managing reputation. Rather, thought needs to be given to how funding and institutional arrangements might support colleagues. At an individual level, it might be thinking about who is doing this work. And at institutional level, it might be thinking about how we conceptualize things like research quality. In 1975, Toni Morrison articulated how the function of racism was to distract. Her concern was not that only that people of colour were required to explain the fact of racism, but also explain its cause and its solution. The obvious question here is, why should a person of colour be best placed to explain white racism? This month, Black History Month, offers another perspective, a month where scholars of colour will be in high demand and visible, invited to talk around stranger places on the issues of race, but later, as the dust settles and people are needed to talk about Americans' foreign policy in relation to the Soviet Union and Ukraine, they will find it much harder to get a gig. The final word then about race in the title. Samuel Johnson's dictionary definition offered 10 definitions of race. The first began with a focus on family relations. Colour features nowhere in Johnson's 10 definitions of race. Johnson draws on Milton and Locke to exemplify established mentions of race in the culture of his time. Johnson's definitions rely on sexual difference, procreation, property, and kind of get into intersectional issues about what does that mean in relation to gender and race in the family. Today in Britain, we understand race very differently. Family may be implicit in the UK legal definition of race, but colour, nationality, and ethnic origin have now been supplanted, or supplanted family as the dominant categories used to frame perceived racial differences. Race is further identified as one of the 9 protected characteristics. The issue with the modern legal definition is the way they tend to separate race out from other characteristics. And it also takes us a long way from Johnson's family delineation. And I think that risks setting analysis at a very sort of supra level without looking at the ways in which issues, for example, of class, gender and race both intersect, but also the way in which issues of race play out in domestic and intimate relations, not just simply in terms of numbers and admissions. Colour did feature in the 18th century, despite Johnson's disavowal, and Johnson's own intimate domestic setting, the presence of Francis Barber, who was black, meant that Johnson himself would have been aware of this. The point of my historical diversion is to highlight both the changing and contradictory nature of race, but also how it operates on the most intimate relational dimensions. And we need to hold on to that, I think, in relation to our teaching and our research. Recognizing the relational aspects invites us to think about how ideas of race are assembled and then potentially disassembled. How do the things come together? How do they connect? It's this form of social analysis that I think Stuart Hall and cultural studies offered that creates and opens the possibility for social change. So Stuart Hall, the great cultural studies theorist who studied here in Oxford in the 1950s, invites us to understand race as a floating signifier. In the film that he made with Jolly, which is there on the left-hand side, he argues that in order to reject the biological determinism of race, we have to explore how it works discursively, through language, through geography, through literature, all themes that this series of lectures will kind of explore, through culture, to understand how it works in our minds. My reference to Johnson is to highlight the changing and contradictory ways we've come to understand it. But my worry is that currently, even attempts to resist racism, some aspects of public discourse are falling back onto essentialist and unproductive binaries. Recognition is needed of the role of imperial formations like race in fragmenting and dissembling all parties of people, both at an individual and a body politic level. The challenge here is how do we take seriously as a social science the range of perspectives on race, including the unpalatable. This means asking difficult questions and warns against self-congratulations. It means taking whiteness seriously as a category of analysis. Both Frantz Fanon and James Baldwin argue that each is within the other, that whiteness and blackness are mutually constituting. Following this idea then is the need to recognize the social and cultural dimensions of race and the ways in which it works in mutually constituting ways. We need to think carefully then about our use of the term race. It's too easy to turn race into a thing rather than a relationship. We might therefore consider the use of a verb to racialize, racialization. This might also help to resolve the contradiction that we're studying something, race, that we know to be a construct, and yet it's very hard and elusive. To focus on the practice of racialization or the practices of racialization of people might help to see things like whiteness as a particular practice that racializes others, but also simultaneously racializes the white person themselves. Now, as part of the History PGC, we ask our trainees to wrestle with an inquiry question. And the inquiry question is used to try to frame a sequence of lesson, but also highlight the thinking that we want the students to do. Doctoral students, you'll be aware, you recognize the process of trying to frame a title in relation to what's the title saying. And this is me wrestling with the title of this seminar series in terms of thinking about it. So using durability may alert us to the manifestations of the past in the present. Swapping out race for racialization serves to resist the rarefication of race, but also focus on the processes at play, processes that are both ambiguous and contradictory. Finally, swapping out and to think about how these practices play out in education reminds us that education is one of the places that these processes play out at both an institutional and individual level. I'm not sure I haven't got there, but it's just trying to complicate the terms that we're using, because I think that in turn helps us think about it. So I'm now going to sort of talk a little bit about some of the research that I'm sort of have done and embarking on now that I've kind of framed the series a little bit. So I'm doing a lot of work with trying to help teachers with their teaching of migration of empire in English schools. And it kind of comes out of a sense in which we know that teachers' own biographies matter in relation to their teaching of these particular topics. We know, Catherine, who's done some work with the Historical Association, that some of them feel that they've got very limited subject knowledge with regard to some of these themes. And they're also aware of the sensitive and contemporary resonances and feel sort of guarded in those particular ways. We also have a very limited understanding of students' perspectives on these issues. not systematic, not big, and things like that. We've got anecdotal evidence here, there, and everywhere. Stefan Klein's work, which is based in Holland with Dutch teachers teaching the transatlantic slave trade, talks about teachers' discomfort of the feeling of being morally judged when they're teaching these particular topics. And the key thing that I sort of alert to, and what Klein was talking about, is we as educators, of teachers, if you like, address more deeply their own insecurities and insensibilities towards sensitive topics like the ones themed in this seminar series. So that was kind of my starting point in terms of what I wanted to do. And I got together with the Runnymede Trust and the Tide team. The Tide team is a sort of travel, transculturality and identity in England in the early modern period. They were based at Liverpool. They're now based at Oxford University. They moved down here. But when we did this Beacon Fellowship, they were based in Liverpool. And we collaborated on a sort of Beacon Fellowship to try with 12 teachers to try and help them with those insensitivities and teaching with these topics. And one of the models of professional growth that we adopted was the Clark and Hollingsworth model that kind of offered us a more complex way of thinking about teacher learning as a way of thinking about teacher professional growth. This model is empirically based, but it's not necessarily related to the themes of empire, migration, and belonging. But when you see it, it's kind of they're sort of saying that the domain of practice, which is the classroom, you don't just simply change classroom practice by giving them new resources. So, for example, I was involved in some work with our migration story, which is great, fantastic online presence, but teachers still felt like I just need to know a little bit more about how I use these materials, the sensitivities with regard to that. So if you only have an external source of information, you're not necessarily going to get that change in practice. What you could do is use the external sources of information to get teachers to think about their own knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes. And that in turn might help teachers partly to think about what they're doing in the classroom, but also to think about what are the aims and purposes of what I'm teaching in the classroom. Now, we felt this was a really useful way of thinking about these sensitive issues of empire, migration, and race in the classroom, because fundamentally, we want teachers to start thinking about where do their ideas and beliefs and attitudes in relation to these themes come from, and how do they fit with regard to existing kind of scholarship. And the other key dimension is the need to get teachers to sort of reflect on those sort of dimensions of that interplay between talking about some of the things that they're getting from the external sources of information. So what we gave them was a 12-week program with 6 cumulative masterclasses. And in each masterclass, they all met at National Archives is a fantastic venue, seeing the Windrush Manifest as well, fantastic. And in those masterclasses, we met as a group and we were able to talk, reflect, and enact. But in between each masterclass, there were these weekly online forums. And so they were also sort of ways in which the teachers were being exposed to ideas, but coming to the masterclass to reflect on those sets of ideas. So the online forums were set up around a range of key words that the Tide team sort of were researching in their research on travel, transculturality, and identity in the early modern period. So each week they were given a sort of different theme. So for example, Savage and Heathen, they were given an essay by the academic about that particular term in the early modern period. They were given some historical documents. So in this case, it was the first Crown Charter. They were given some literary documents that explored the theme. In this case, it was extracts from Shakespeare's Tempest. And they were given some beyond text sort of imagery or objects or buildings and things like that in order to start helping think about that particular theme, and then come to the masterclass to talk about some of the ideas that come out of it, of that sort of exploration. Not necessarily ideas for the classroom, but actually what's it making you think about your knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes? And what does that mean in terms of what your aims are within your classroom? So we're kind of just trying to develop this sort of interconnected project. And then Abby, who's going to talk in a moment, we were trying to research what was kind of going on. So we did pre-survey, sort of some interviews, observations. We did some post-survey fellowship interviews. And I went into some schools to then start when they got a little bit further on about looking at their instructional artifacts and objects. I'm going to hand over to Abby, who's going to go and give a case study of one of the fellows. Go on.
Cheers. Hi, everyone. So while I was a research assistant on the Tide project, I had the opportunity to speak to some of the fellows about the experience of the fellowship. And so I'm just going to talk about Heather, who had been teaching for 4 years already, but she'd originally trained as an English teacher. So she was really keen to make use of opportunities to learn about the craft of history teaching in particular. In the pre-course survey, she identified as British and mixed race, Black, Caribbean, and white. But let's look further into what Jason has explained as the personal domain in that previous slide. So for Heather, learning had already been influencing her personal domain, her knowledge and beliefs, before the fellowship had even started, through her personal experiences as well as her independent reading. She spoke about growing up in a white neighborhood and race not being a lens through which she had interpreted her experiences at the time. But that began to change when, before she became a teacher, she was working in London and found that her experiences were highly racialized. She also found that in her school, race became an explanatory factor for some of her students' experiences. She would describe how Black students at the school were often treated differently from white students. She was also reading popular Black British histories like Staying Power and Black Tudors before the fellowship began, which opened her to the possibility that there were gaps within her own history education. She said how, she'd been learning about the Tudors for years and years, and no one had said, well, Black people lived in England during this period. So the revelations about her own knowledge are taking place, and teachers, like students, are not blank slates when they enter into these fellowship programs. And learning, therefore, takes place entangled with these multiple personal dynamics beyond the fellowship. So now that we've gotten to know Heather a little bit, let's look at the sequences within that interconnected model that are taking place. So the ethos of the fellowship was, here are some additional narratives saying maybe this is something to consider, but not being overly prescriptive about what teachers should be doing in the classroom. So the weekly reading packs, the discussions with historians, teacher facilitators like Jason, as well as with the other fellows, are all stimuli in this external domain. And while engaging with these additional narratives from the external domain, Heather reflected on how she had been teaching a few one-dimensional histories in her domain of practice. She says, I feel like Islamic history is rarely taught in school outside the Crusades. So often it seems to be linked to war, Crusades, fall of Constantinople, terrorism, etc. It seems very reductive and potentially very alienating for our Muslim students. So as her knowledge of Islamic history grows, so she's seeing more problems, but also possibilities with her teaching. She also refines what the outcomes are that she wants for her students, this bottom bubble. She wants her students to have a mastery of complex narratives in which places are not only seen through a deficit lens, but also an agentive one. She writes, currently, we only touch on India during a unit on the consequences of the British Empire. The current depiction of India is pretty one-dimensional and negative. It would be great to build in some of what we've been discussing during the fellowship about the wealth and power that existed there. She also says, we don't really touch on Indigenous populations in our American unit, except to say that many Indigenous people were treated badly and died because of European diseases. It would be great if we were able to show students a more complex picture that existed, including agency on both sides. And so through this external stimuli of the program, all this reflection is taking place on her aims and her knowledge, and opening up new possibilities for the domain of practice, the possibility that these one-dimensional narratives might change. So I've just given you a bit of a taste of what was going on for one fellow, where she was asking herself exactly where in her syllabus is the historical narrative a bit thin, and how could those narratives open up in a way that accords with her overall aims for her students. And now I'll hand back to Jason.
So taking that a bit further forward, we then were given some more money by the ERC for something called the Traction Project. We expanded, we doubled the number of fellows, this is 24 fellows, and we also doubled the range. The original fellows were actually very atypical. That of the 12, I think 9 were people from minoritized backgrounds, which is not representative of the teaching workforce at all. So the Traction, we're kind of trying to now develop an online platform that follows a similar model to what we were trying to do with the actual fellowship, with the Tide Beacon Fellowship. What we did do is we started to expand the subject module. So as well as having the early modern period, we started to talk to colleagues across the collegiate university who helped start to populate different aspects of these subject modules. So we had an 18th and 19th century module now, and you can see some of the sort of topics that they explore within that particular module right up to the 20th and 21st century. And people like Peter Frankopan in the middle there, he would make a film talking about sort of encounters and engagements of this that the teachers would then sort of engage with and think about. We also wanted to give them something, a pedagogy module. So as well as the subject models, before they kind of went into the subject module, we wanted them to sort of do a pre-course appraisal and then sort of do this module on preparing to think and learn do the subject module, then come out of that and then think about their school context. Because what might work in one school may not work in another school. Think about your students, think about your colleagues, think about those particular dimensions. So it wasn't about telling them what to do, it was about trying to give them some tools to think about knowledge, beliefs and attitudes, but then also tools to think about what does that mean in your context, not hang them out to dry in that particular dimension. So the pedagogy module also had a reflection document that they kind of were asked to come back to after each sort of module that they did. And the first sort of module, preparing to think, learn and teach, was based on so I made a film based on this synthesis by Harbin et al. About teaching race and social justice, offering sort of 6 principles that they might use in relation to their teaching of any of the topics that they've encountered in the subject modules that were run by the academic colleagues, and then having some reflection about those principles. Are they currently there in your teaching practice? If they're in value, how would you implement them? If it's not currently there, what action do you need to take? So trying to get them to think about where are you with these principles, and where do you need to sort of kick on in relation to these principles? The reflection document threw up a whole range of different, and you can sort of, this is just a smattering, obviously giving us some feedback data as well. But you can sort of see teachers thinking about the bigger picture, streamlining or strengthening their rationale for what they're doing in the classroom. Feeling excited that they can make changes in their classroom as well. But this last one, I found the reading absolutely fascinating, illuminating, but also deeply troubling and shocking. So it's that sort of sense of kind of returning back to that affective needs and desires, as well as the cognitive changes that need to happen. That applies as much to adults as it does to young people, because we also have our affective needs and desires, and that needs to be taken account of as well. So a kind of summary is that with those 2 projects, we felt that exposure to academic scholarship was potentially hugely beneficial in building their confidence in teaching topics like empire, migration and race. It enabled their perspectives to alter and broaden. It highlighted the value of interdisciplinary conversations. So if we're thinking about race as a social construct, how does that work in English, science and history, not simply in relation to one particular subject? It highlighted the value of primary text to give them some sort of purchase on the ways in which those things are constructed. It gave them a greater sense of the scale and complexity of empire and beyond sort of simple binaries. Nevertheless, what we also learned is that teacher learning was individually and socially situated, also true of the younger learners that they're sort of dealing with. And it needs to account for, any sort of teacher development program needs to account for the range of social cultural settings and offer that role of mediation to carefully help teachers with that particular range of different settings. So I think in terms of taking it further forward, we need a greater recognition of the multiple contexts in which this work actually exists. And in particular, a real clearer sense of pupil frameworks, the interpretive frameworks that young people are bringing into the classroom when they think about race, migration and empire. Terry Epstein's work on this is fantastic. So that brings me to my final project, and this is just starting. So given all of that, the Pears Foundation has funded a joint UCL-Oxford project to create, it's a 3-year research project to build a portrait of teaching empire, migration and belonging in English schools. The aim behind this project ultimately is to inform the creation of a professional development program that takes account of the range of context and also the pupils' interpretive frameworks. So we've got a greater sense of what's coming in to the classrooms, but also a greater sense of what teachers are coming up against in terms of their own context as well. And we do that because we believe that education practice is informed by academic scholarship, but empirical research and practical understandings of classroom experience. The previous 2 projects had a lot of the academic scholarship, but less of the empirical research and practical understanding of what's actually happening in classrooms. So the project's going to be broken down into 4 different areas. So the first strand is looking at the discursive context of empire, migration and belonging. And what we're doing there is we're mapping policy, but we're also mapping the academic scholarship in terms of what historians of empire are saying currently about history, how they framing it and things like that. Then there's 2 empirical strands, strand B and strand C, looking at teachers and looking at young people, trying to find out a little bit about what those insecurities and insensibilities that Klein was talking about are, in order for us to help support them in overcoming those insensibilities and insecurities. But equally, we need to know about students. What about their online lives? Where are they encountering issues around race? And trying to sort of find out a little bit more about that. And the final strand is analysis of textbooks associated with classroom resources. The Institute of Education at UCL has got a textbook archive that goes back to the 1890s, and we're looking at geography textbooks, history textbooks, and English textbooks to think about how these themes are represented at different historical moments within the journey of this particular project. So I'm going to end by sort of saying I think there are some hopeful steps forward. So, for example, every history exam board now offers at GCSE an Empire and Migration module. Pearson was the last to come on board, but it's now offered it, and so they're now doing this work. And yes, as children can study these topics, it's still an option. I think the indications, Catherine, are that people are taking up these options as history teachers, and I think that's all really positive. But I think we still got to recognise that this kind of happened, if you like, pre-George Floyd. You know, some of these initiatives happened pre-George Floyd, and I think since there's a lot of good things about that because it's raised the salience of it, but it's also raised the stakes, and it's raised the stakes for teachers in the sense that actually teachers are now being pulled betwixt and between in relation to, you've got people like this is Deanna Heath at Liverpool University historians that say teachers are whitewashing the curriculum. Well, even on my anecdotal evidence of the 40 partnership schools that we work with, I defy anybody to find a place that doesn't teach some aspect of empire. So it's probably not true to say that, but that's where this is being conducted. But equally, there's other people sort of saying, you know, they're only teaching the bad things, they're making people feel guilty and things like that. So there's this whole, and I think that makes it harder for teachers. And I think we need to sort of try to sort of think about those sort of dimensions as well. The government advice doesn't help. This is from the Historical Association's TEACH report. TEACH stands for Teaching Emotive and Controversial Histories. And it's just that last bit about reminding ourselves about why this work needs doing, that such issues and disparities create a strong resonance with students in particular educational settings. I set that up at the beginning with my Oxford student from one of our local schools, talking about wanting to have this. And I think the work is hard, it involves risks, but it is worth doing. I think it's worth doing for the young people because they're demanding it, but it's also worth doing because it helps us as a society and a nation understand better the place we're in. Thank you very much. Now, neither of you two are talking, are you? I mean, you are talking, but you're not presenting.
I mean, I could do it through dance. But...
Okay, interpretive dance is great. Do you want to go next, Michelle? Shall we have some lights up?
Can everyone hear me? I've got my teacher voice on.
Jason, can you introduce?
Yeah, so Michelle is a teacher who works at one of our local schools, Charwell, but she's also, are you vice president of the NASUWT?
I'm now honorary treasurer.
She's the honorary treasurer of the NASUWT, citizen teacher,
yes.
And she's going to talk a little bit about that particular perspective on some of these issues.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
And I smiled because I'm responsible for at least one of those headlines on the
Are you?
Yeah, I did a critical Google search the other day and realised I've been quoting the Daily Express and the Daily Mail. I think I've made it. So hello, I'm Michelle. I think I'm going to start kind of where I am and how I got to be here and why I'm so passionate about this work. So I don't have a PowerPoint, but I was teaching all day today and I'm PowerPointed out, to be absolutely honest. But kind of pick up about pedagogy and actually, Jason, your presentation, I'm going to think about ways I can steal that because there was a lot of the discussions that we're having on the practical sense. So I'm not an academic. Definitely putting that out there, but I am 15 years in the classroom. So who am I? So my name is Michelle Codrington-Rogers. You might recognise the surname Codrington being linked to a very famous library in the city of Oxford. But I'm a Jericho girl. I grew up just down the road and I grew up in the shadow of Oxford University. I went to local schools. I now teach back at my school that I went to. But this is where the but comes in. How did I get to be where I am today? I was the naughty kid at school. I was the one who would walk out of lessons if it just wasn't engaging me enough or if I was bored, and I'd wander into the library, and they always find me sat in the library surrounded by books, refusing to go back into the classroom. I was the girl who was always fighting. I was the girl who was always answering back, but most importantly, I was always the girl who would ask the question why. And I think that's kind of where I've always been that person who always wants to know the reason why. And I'm really fortunate because I'm first generation. So my parents are from Tomlinson. My mum came over to the UK first. She was part of the end tail of Windrush generation. And then my dad came over as well after they got married. So I was brought up by people who were definitely impacted by the empire. So this didn't get its independence until 1979. So I'm actually older than my country of origins, independence. And that's something that was really important to my mum and dad, that their daughters knew where they were from. They knew and were connected to the land, not just via Britain owning the peoples of our land, but actually being connected to the land. And we learned a lot of our history and a lot of who we were through our parents and grandparents, talking about the island, using the language that they use, cooking the food, but taking us back there so that we actually had the opportunity that a lot of, I guess, second generation, let's say black children don't have, because I got the chance to go back to see what a country where I'm in the majority looks like, where you can see street sweepers, but you'll also see the bank manager, the prime minister walking through the centre of town and everyone talking to them, but everybody looks like you. And that's huge. That's really, really an important part of my identity. So when I got into trouble in year 8 because a boy felt it was okay to call me a black pig, I was confident enough in who I was when the teacher said to me, would it have been as bad if he hadn't called you black? And I said, I wouldn't have punched him as hard. So I've always had that confidence of knowing who I am. And for me, that's really, I think that's really at the centre of what we're talking about when we talk about race. How did I end up as a teacher? Well, I always wanted to be a long-distance lorry driver. I did want to be a farmer at one point. My mum convinced me that I should want to become a teacher. I was adamant I was not going to be a teacher. It's the last thing I was going to do. She likes this point when I introduce myself, because wherever she is, she hears the words "Mum was right." So I went into teaching. I went into teaching for a lot of different reasons, but mainly because I came into where I am via the political route. So I was a student involved in politics. I got to study overseas in Southern Oregon University, where I became really part of a very small community of black students. And I use the word black as a political sense, and I use it from a place of strength. Now, one of the first things I have to do with my classes every single year in the first lesson is give them the permission to use the word black. Because students would come in and they'll say, I'll say, for example, put your bag on the floor, and they go, which bag, miss? Is it that one that's over there? Or is it that one? Or, and I'll say, it's the black bag. Because for children, the thing that they are most worried about being called is racist. Children are scared about talking about race because they see so many grown-ups getting it wrong. They see so many grown-ups being told, you're racist and you need to stop it. But if we can't open up those spaces for children and young people to talk about it, then they're never going to have the opportunity to practice what it means to be a non-racist person in our society. And they're struggling within this context of interpersonal racism, intrapersonal racism, structural and systemic racism, and institutional racism. We as adults can't even navigate that. And yet we expect children to be able to become the citizens of tomorrow without even giving them the tools to be able to communicate. And when you take words away from them, they struggle. So I give them permission to use the word black. I say, if you ever need to describe me to anyone, you're allowed to say a black woman. You're allowed to say my teacher is a black woman. Just bring in the fact that I wear locks as well, and that I'm just cool. But I also give them permission to use the word white as well. And I explain to them, even to my year 7s, why I use the term black. I teach in one, I'm going to say this, I might get strung up for it, and I hope it is recorded. I teach at one of the best schools in Oxford. Teach at one of the best state schools in Oxford. We compete with the independent schools that we're surrounded by. We are multicultural, we're diverse, we're non-uniform. That plays a huge role in children being able to identify themselves. But if we don't give them the language, how can they go out and become citizens? And that's why I became a citizenship teacher. Citizenship is the best subject. Because we carry on where history ends. History ends when End of the Second World War, we get the UN, the European Union, etc. But in citizenship, we turn that into, how does that explain the world that we live in today? How can we apply what we learned about the history into how we have conversations and interact with each other today? How do we explain why I'm sitting here today, 2022, someone who looks like me is sitting in this space? And I give the children their permission, I give them the permission to be able to think about how and who existed before me for me to come here. And that's really crucial. But I do that as a citizenship teacher because I've got the confidence. I also like to take risks. And the amount of times I've been in trouble with the head teacher, I can't even count it on two hands. Because I encourage the children to engage in that struggle, whether it is about identity or whether it is about being active citizens. I say to the kids, this is the best time that you can go and get into some good trouble. Because when you get into trouble, it's me that the head teacher wants to see. I also have the opportunity because the head teacher used to be my former teacher. So he knows I always get into trouble. He literally does expect whenever the kids are in trouble that I'm somewhere in the mix. But that's what citizenship does. So history and English and all the other subjects almost seem like they're trying to shift into spaces so that they can create these conversations, whereas in citizenship, that's just what happens in our subject. And we have to be brave with it. And we have to say to the kids, you might not always like what I'm saying, and I might not always like what you're saying, but let's have those conversations. And I love being a citizenship teacher because I get to have conversations with kids where they think nobody else wants to hear them having those conversations. I have students who, as part of their GCSE citizenship, we teach it as a compulsory subject in Year 9 and Year 10. All of our students sit the GCSE citizenship. When they have to choose their projects, they're given complete free rein. So I always get a couple of boys who talk about racism in football. I always get racism in general. And then I'll always get those absolute little diamonds in the rough where I'll have a student who wants to do a project about partition and wants school to teach about it because it impacts his family history. I get children who want to do decolonising the curriculum, who challenge the fact that, and this is a little conversation we had before, this is Black History Month, which is never, you can never kind of squeeze it into one month. But it's Black History Month, so my school, as much as I love my school, is celebrating the fact that now they finally understood what it means to be decolonising the curriculum and history. Bear in mind, I've been at the school for 15 years, and I was always the one who did the Black History Month assembly. And then I stopped. I said, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I cannot keep doing this emotional lifting. But now I have students saying they want to do decolonising the curriculum. And they identify where in the curriculum they feel they're being let down. My schools celebrate Black History Month. It's now, we've got our now curriculum, which the history department is sharing across every single school, every single lesson, every single form group. Yet in English, we still teach of mice and men. It can't be both. And this is, I think, what you were saying, Jason, is we're seeing the struggle, but the lack of understanding that actually what happens in this hand also impacts on what's happening in that hand. It upsets children. Our children get angry, they get frustrated. The only language they can think of is that teacher is racist, which then the other teacher who they're complaining to says they can't be. What else happened? So as I was leaving today, I've got 3 ghosts. I call them my ghosts at school. I've got 3 ghosts, children who are just never in lessons. These children wander the halls. You know, they're always either going somewhere, they're like Frodo of the Shire. They're just walking around school, constantly popping their heads in. They always come in, LMS, how are you? They know my timetable better than me. And one of my ghosts, I bumped into as he was coming out of school, and he was really irate. And there was a group of boys around him, and they were waiting for the year leader to come. And I said, what's wrong? What's going on? I try and leave, I won't use their names, but if I do slip, it's a completely made up thing. And he goes, I just got a C3 detention. For what? What did you do? Teacher said something about a lewd act. I don't even know what that means. So the other boy, one of the other boys goes to him, what did you do? And he goes, I literally licked my lips, miss. And I go, well, who were you looking at when you did that? Maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a girl, maybe it was He said, no, miss, I was looking at my book. So I've been accused of a lewd act. It doesn't help that this is a young black boy who is already struggling to stay in school. Through that conversation, the 3 other boys who were also stood with him, of which 3 of them were black or dual heritage boys, have all got into trouble that lesson. So as teachers, we need that space, not just to think about our pedagogy, we need to think about what power and influence we are having on the children and young people. When a teacher reads of mice and men, and whether they say the N-word or not, the fact of the matter is they are giving value to that book. It's being included as part of a qualification. It's seen as important. Children do not have the power to challenge that, because that's what being a teacher is. A teacher is to have been in that room where you have power. And as a black queer woman, when I stand in front of my classes, they see me in my full intersectionality, because I tell my children who I am, because it's really important. I'm one of the best schools in Oxford, and it's only this year, I think, we finally got 2 female black teachers. We've got 1 assistant head who's absolutely fantastic, who is of dual heritage, also from Oxford like I am, and he is constantly fighting to keep our kids in school. Because we know that if they leave our school, they will not get the life chances that they would get from being at my school which competes with independent schools for results. But if you don't marry it all up together, this is where it kind of comes back to the theme. Because in education, we're still in a battleground, because a lot of what we teach is shaped by empire and history. What we give value to is considered cultural. So when Ofsted are doing inspections into access to culture, they're measuring it on access to things that, for example, isn't part of our culture. When my children see me standing up in front of my class, I stand up as a reflection of them. But there aren't enough black teachers. So it almost feels like we're in this generation where the first generation, second generation children who are children of empire, of Commonwealth, we finally matured into becoming teachers. Because for our parents and our grandparents, there are certain jobs you do: medicine, teaching, dentistry, these professional jobs which our grandparents wanted and parents wanted us to do, because it was an extra layer to protect us from racism. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that by being professional, you will not experience the racism that I experienced as someone who had to do a skilled job. But we're seeing that generation of teachers being decimated because they are still experiencing racism in the classroom. They experience it not from the kids, but from parents and carers and from their own colleagues. So we can't on one hand be talking about decolonising the curriculum and patting ourselves on the back for Black History Month if we've still got policies that for uniforms say children aren't allowed to have braids, or they're not allowed to have particular haircuts because it symbolises being part of a gang, or they're not allowed to have locks, or they're not allowed. We're policing children, and in extension we're policing a community, and by policing that community we're kind of recycling and re-energizing those divisions that were brought about to excuse and to allow and to encourage empire building. Because if we're not seen, then we can be controlled. And if we're controlled, then we don't challenge the status quo. And we're talking about a status quo that has been built on hundreds of years of absolute brutal colonizational policies that were born in Oxford. So I always come back to, why am I here today? Why am I in Oxford? How did I end up here? It could be my ancestors speaking to us that we ended up in Oxford, next to a library that I didn't know existed when I was younger, until my dad got a phone call asking for a donation to the preservation of the Codrington-Rogers. You have to realise that we carry empire and colonisation with us in our blood. So we can decolonize curriculums, but we have to recognize the impact it has on our communities. It's talking about our history, but it's also recognizing that our history is not the same as your history. Yes, working classes benefited from the colonization, but, and there's always a but, who's part of that working class? So I've said that unfortunately I'm not going to be able to join you guys later because I'm going to the TUC this weekend. It's been reorganised. I'm now down in Brighton where I'm going to have the fun of seconding the motion on racism. And I'm going to do exactly what you were talking about in your presentation. Anti-racism isn't my fight. I didn't cause it. I'm subject to it. But this is only something that can be challenged by the people in the majority. That's white people. I get exhausted doing the anti-racism work because I'm not always in the right spaces to talk to the right people. So you might hear another headline that I've been involved in where TUC trade union movement gets called out for institutional racism, but we've got to talk about it. It's not my job to solve it as it is in education. But it's one of my jobs with my opportunity and the privilege I have to be in those spaces where I can call it out. Every time I stand up in front of a class or in a panel, or I'm able to make myself heard, I'm represented more than the sum of my current parts. Everything I do, I've got the voice of my ancestors in my ears, giving me power and strength that they weren't able to have because of the position that they were in society at the time. This is why I'm so passionate about making sure we create an educational space where all of our children are seen and they're all able to have those voices. Because I didn't realise until I left school how powerful my voice can be. So my three ghosts know that they can come to me and I will try and amplify their voices. But I'll also see them as well. So when we talk about colleagues who are coming and doing that work, who are having that opportunity to be able to look at the academic aspect of decolonising the curriculum, I always look at it from the other perspective, which is, let's look at it from the social and the community side of it. How can we be bringing community into what our kids are learning about? How can they see the people who are respected in their areas, in their cultures, in their hobbies and interests? How can they be seen how can they see that is given value? That's what the job is of teachers as well. So we can do the decolonising stuff as part of the curriculum. And one of the reasons I will also confess as well is after George Floyd, and I do use that is a seminal moment. But for a lot of us in the Black community, it's nothing new. Just this time it was captured on video. And this time people felt they needed to share it with us to tell us they now understand. I haven't watched that video yet. Lots of people sent it to me, but why would I want to watch another lynching of another Black man? Why would I want to watch it? I'm glad it woke up a lot of people. And I'm sorry if there are people in this room who until George Floyd's murder didn't realise that there was an issue with the police. But there are those of us in this room who know that this is nothing new. The murder of George Floyd has been seen as a seminal moment and kind of an impetus to do right, to try and rebalance when it comes to race and ethnicity and identity. Maybe I've been in this game too long, but I've seen these seminal moments before. I was young when Stephen Lawrence was murdered. I've grown up with the Stephen Lawrence murder. I've had the fortune to sit at the same table as Stephen's parents and be at a ceremony to celebrate his life. But there will be another seminal moment. And there'll be another, and there'll be another. And every time it almost feels like we reset and we always start again. So I might be a bit jaded, and I apologise if I'm jaded, but this is the reason why I went into teaching. Because the kids give me so much hope. They see it and they want the world to be better, and they're not sitting waiting for us to do it. Our kids are doing it. They're developing the language, they're developing the communities, They're developing the people they trust. So while we're looking at our neighbours, kind of talk about what does decolonisation look like, which is something that they say, miss, just get on with it. That's what they do. They're just doing it. They just expect it. When you give them a project to do, they are picking people that they look up to. Black and brown people who are doing the work that they want. They may not be the quality that examinations measure, but they're definitely something that children see and they recognise. And we are talking about intersectionality now. We're seeing that happening so much more. Our children understand that because their identity is something very personal to them. As teachers, we've got a responsibility to get some of that confidence to do the work that's needed to make it stick in education. Because we owe it to the children and we owe it to the next generation. But as teachers, we have to be brave. And when the government's attacking us, as you can see, as you said, and accusing us of being involved in a culture war and being woke, I don't mind being woke. I'd rather be woke than asleep, I can tell you that. As if they haven't seen the Matrix, you know. I'd rather be on this side, and our children would rather be on that side. I can stand up and I can be told you mustn't be talking about politics because you need to be politically impartial. That's being targeted at citizenship teachers. There's not enough of us as it is. And people are in jobs where they're worried that they're going to be on the front page of the next Daily Mail. As I said, my head teacher's used to me, so the day I get on the Daily Mail, yeah, I think he'll see it as a badge of honour. Definitely. But we've got that responsibility to be brave. So whether you are a citizenship teacher or history or politics or English or maths or year 1 or year 2, year 3, the way that we do it is by creating space for our children and young people and for us to have these conversations with them. We don't talk down to the children because they have a very real version of the world that they live in. And that's our responsibility. We've got to be confident and not be scared, because as teachers, our responsibility is to build free thinkers, the people who want to make the world better, even if it's just their small little corner. And the thing that I think I'll probably end on, because I think I'm probably
Well, it's probably all my fault.
no, that's fine. I could keep going. I can't be politically impartial. I'm a black woman in Britain. Just by my presence, I'm political. Not big P politics, but small P politics. But the worst thing is I'm a black woman with a very loud voice. And I don't mind going into spaces where I feel uncomfortable, because uncomfortable is where we need to be having that struggle. So it's through use of language, it's through use of the topics that you're teaching. Whatever I teach at school, I bring in a decolonised version, whether I'm talking about enslavement, or whether I'm talking about human rights, or whether I'm talking about, let's just say, sustainable development goals. That's my responsibility to open that up to our students. I mean, I never am on the scheme of work. I'm always out of the scheme of work behind everybody else. I just often do my own thing. But I know that one of my ghosts, he was wandering around one day, as he always did, came in, all right, miss, okay, what are you doing? Talking about modern day slavery. But I'm starting at a place for my ancestors. Do you want to come in? All right, miss, came in, sat down, we want a piece of paper and a pen. Yeah, got it. And he sat in my lesson for 20 minutes. Didn't say a word, making notes. As soon as I finished talking, I said to the class, right, now we're moving on. In his usual way, got up, all right, miss, see you later, walked out. He's totally part-time at school. It's on his own terms. He goes where he wants to. So I know our kids want to hear it, but they want to be seen. They want to be part of the story of Britain, and we need to get them to a place where we meet them where they are. And I think that's where we need to be building confidence for teachers. And that's where we need to be building confidence as academics as well, where we can come together to create those spaces where children are able to learn and engage, where we're able to give them language, but we're able to give them the space to shape what it is that they learn. We can do all that stuff for the exams. Of course we can. Some schools have become exam factories, let's be honest. All they do is teach kids how to ask questions. And that's why I'm always lagging behind, because I refuse to do that. And it's interesting you said about Pearson being asked to come on board. One of my really good friends worked at Pearson, and she kept going to me, oh yeah, we're working on this book, so I do apologise on behalf of that, because I know that she was doing some of that work. she doesn't get it. She was a bit, all this wokeness is ruining the publishing industry, but she knows who I am, so it's absolutely fine. But it's about our responsibility about giving space to reflect and space to change and space to turn. And that's why I'm passionate as a citizenship teacher, because I am able to do that in that space. But I'm really fortunate with my privilege. I teach at a school where I don't get people coming and telling me what I have to teach. I've been teaching long enough. I'm too much of a trade unionist and a troublemaker for anyone to tell me otherwise. And it's always just taken as a given that Miss Codrington is not going to be on scheme. So thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, so finally, Sally Tomlinson. A quick roundup of that. Sally's done a lot of work on this.
No, I mean, I had a chat with Lenny Henry last night, he was at the Cheltenham Literary Festival, educating Cheltenham, which is, it's where all the old colonels who've been running Nigeria retired to, you know. So he was educating Cheltenham. Anyway, no, he was doing a talk there, and, you know, we had a lot of laughs, because that's one way of getting over, you know, some of the issues that actually we're all trying to grapple with now, is when we can actually have a laugh about it. There's not a lot to laugh about. I've been around for a long time. My first job was in 1968, when I was a primary school teacher in Wolverhampton. Well, no, Wolverhampton, no, centre of the universe. My entire class, you know, was kids from the Caribbean and the Asian subcontinent, and I was brought up, you know, with the pink bits on the wall that belonged to us, you know, and you have this feeling of you were part of the empire, and it was a great thing. And there was absolutely no criticism during my upbringing about that the empire might not be a good thing, and that going into people's countries and looting their land and labour was not a good idea. But you know, people still do it. So what to do, you know? So I remember going to the head teacher and saying, you know, what do I do with, you know, with the children? And she said, just treat them all as children, dear. So you treated them all as children, you know, i.e. you taught them to read, write, and do number and so on, you know. But obviously you were surrounded by a whole white society that didn't want these kids in Wolverhampton, and our MP was a guy called Enoch Powell. Does that ring a bell? Hands up, people who know Enoch Powell. Okay, so here's something. Okay, Enoch Powell was a member of Parliament who had actually served in India during the war. He was a very bright bloke. Came to Oxford, of course. You know, Oxford has a lot to answer for. And, so Enoch was a brigadier in India and came back, and he he wasn't too bad about empire, because most of the politicians post World War II in Britain were imperialists, obviously. You know, this was just, they wanted to keep the empire. They were very sad when India got its independence in 1947. Powell was furious because he loved India. He really thought it should belong to Britain. And yeah, why not? You know. And so he discovered, actually, he wanted to be Prime Minister, and he discovered that a good way to get to the Prime Minister is, actually, we're having some lessons, aren't we, on how to be a Prime Minister. He thought the best way to be a Prime Minister was to attack immigrants, as you know. Well, I think it was our last Prime Minister, but 1, 2, 3, was it 3? Actually thought it was a good idea to have a hostile environment and attack immigrants. Okay, well, Powell did, and he, in 1968-69, when I was, you know, trying to teach kids, he was making speeches. He made an awful speech called Rivers of Blood. You know, Britain was busy building its own funeral pyre by letting people in from imperial colonial captives. And very soon, he was a Greek scholar, like Boris Johnson, actually. Prime ministers have to learn Greek, Oxford. And you know, the streets were going to run with blood, you know, with immigrants coming into the country. You know, it was all right racist. So it was very difficult, because I do remember, you know, one day a group of mothers stopped me in the street. You know, those are the days when mothers couldn't come into school. You actually had to meet them out in the street. And they said to me, who is this man? You know, he invited us when he was Minister of Health. He did. To come to this country as nurses and people to come and work here and build Britain up after the Second World War. And now he's telling us to go home. He doesn't want us here. So, you know, what was one to say at that point, except, yeah, you know, racism was really all around us. Powell actually got the sack from Ted Heath's shadow cabinet then, but then he went off to Ireland and created a whole lot of mayhem in Northern Ireland as a unionist MP. But what I'm just going to briefly talk to you about is the antagonism that carried on from Powell's time, because it's not gone away. I mean, Wednesday, I have a piece of paper here. I've got an invitation actually to a right-wing think tank called Politia, and this is run by a woman called Sheila Laura, which again, you know, we may have heard of, but you may not. She's been around for a long time, and she lives in Cambridge, and her husband and various other Cambridge professors, dare I say, are quite antagonistic to notions of decolonising the curriculum, changing the curriculum in schools. What we need is a traditional British curriculum, you know, just as we all learned about it in the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, when the Board of Education had a decent curriculum. You know, Michael Gove had that curriculum, and he brought it back in 2013. So we're being a bit slow at changing this curriculum. Anyway, Politia tomorrow, it's, I'll put my glasses on to read it. We are looking tomorrow at history, whose history. So there we have, and so we have 4 people, two Cambridge professors, and a guy from Oxford, we won't mention him, and Sheila Laura, actually she's about to be made Lord for a lady by Johnson and put in the House of Lords. And again, it's almost what we're talking about today. What are the aims and obligations of the current history curriculum for British Empire, European, and so on? How does it accord with professional freedom in teaching, you see? Should we all be teaching the Stone Age in Romans, present day, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yes, and then how do we make sure that history teaching in schools is not politicised? I'm sure we all know the answer to that one. Yeah. I've actually just written a book on ignorance. There's a lot of it about. But actually, one of the themes I kept going in it's actually interesting this, because again, going right back to 1942, William Beveridge wrote a report which started off our welfare state. You know, it was actually on social security, and after the war, we then got, you know, these the Social Security Acts. We also had the 1944 Education Act, which gave secondary education for the first time, secondary education to all children in England. So, Beveridge said that there were 5 giants that had to be overcome in a society, and these were want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. So this editor had the bright idea of asking 5 of us to write books. Want, poverty, disease,
Health.
Thank you. Health. Ignorance.
Education.
Squalor. Housing. Yeah. Idleness.
Unemployment.
Employment, yes. And actually, 4 of the books are out, but idleness is being a bit slow. It's only £15. So, I'm just briefly going to go there and say, right from the Second World War, when of course we had migration into the country, people from the Caribbean, the Asian subcontinent, and later from Africa and other places came into the country, and actually to help build up Britain, obviously, and got no thanks for it. In fact, you know, they just got a whole load of racism. So the 1960s, there was a schools council for the curriculum, which actually was very good, because they paid got money to actually run projects, you know, sort of early research projects on how do we actually teach the empire and you know, so a guy called Lawrence Stenhouse did a very good project on how you teach race relations, as we called it then. But it was frowned upon, and not, you know, the politicians and policymakers who are nearly all educated outside our state system. This is quite important, that the public schools have this curriculum from the 19th century, which was basically an ethnocentric, racist curriculum as it prepared men, mainly young boys, to go out literally and run Nigeria, run India, you know, run. And that's what our top public schools did. And a lot of them still have that feeling that this is what they do. And they haven't changed their curriculum very much. And you can tell that from how many of our prime ministers just recently, I think, have been to Eton. The Eton really is, you know, maybe a very nice school, but, you know, it produced Boris Johnson and well, various other people. Theresa May actually only had 3 Etonians in her cabinet, but Johnson had 6, including himself. If you don't go to the state schools, if you're not in the state system, you don't know anything about it. You don't know what's being taught, how it's being taught. You just, you know, come at it from your own experience and so on, which is one reason why, you know, our curriculum is, we're having such trouble in actually changing it. The 60s, you know, teachers were getting worried even then. I mean, I was worried, you know, what do I do in order to actually teach children from other countries, other cultures who were migrated into this country? Their parents want them to achieve. That was, you know, very important. But parents also wanted them to know about their own histories, their own backgrounds and so on. The supplementary school movement started then, which was quite good. After school, Saturday schools, where, you know, children were taught about their own backgrounds, the history. But there was a real no-no on actually teaching in schools. In Birmingham, where I was in the 70s, I was doing my own PhD there, and one school in Hansel started a Black Studies course, 1972 Black Studies, and the Chief Education Officer went in person to this school and told them to close it down. We don't want Black Studies in the school. And that was kind of the feeling all along, you know, that you didn't want any teaching like this. However, here's the very first book called The Multiracial School. I still have a copy, it's fallen to bits, 1971. And it was written by 2 people called Julia McNeill and Margaret Rogers. They were both teachers. Julia McNeill was actually the daughter of Hugh Gateskill, who would have been a good prime minister here, but unfortunately he died. But he was an MP, and he was actually one of the few politicians who actually was in favour of actually teaching honestly about why we actually had the empire come home, as it were. So we got into the 70s, and the 70s was a real racist decade, actually. That was the time when you know, people really were suffering from racism wherever you went. There was a National Front, you know, which was the white nationalist fascist movements, and they actually used to give leaflets out outside schools, because I had kids at school in the late 70s, and they were handed leaflets, you know, as they came out by the National Front. So it got even, you know, more worrying, you know, what's going on. And of course, by 1981, we then had race riots, you know, in Brixton and cities all around. And politicians had to wake up then, you know, that this was a real problem. And so a guy called Scarman, Lord, oh, you always appoint a Lord, by the way, to, if you want any of these things looked at seriously, you know, you appoint a Lord. Or if you're not a Lord when you start, you're a Lord by the time you finish. Mary Warnock, you know, from the special education. She was a Mrs. Warnock when she started and Lady Warnock when she finished. Into the 80s, we still had quite a lot of antagonism, and the government got a bit worried. And I was on 2 committees all through the 1980s. One to try and bring multicultural education, multiracial education. There were always these arguments about what they were. It was pointless, you know. What a waste of our energy while we argued about what was multicultural. Was teaching the Chinese New Year, was that multicultural, or you know, was it anti-racist? And so anti-racist, anyway. So the 1980s, we had obviously those of us who were, well, by then obviously I was in universities and teacher training, teacher education. I was then told it was not education, it had to be teacher training, we were told in the 1980s. Trying to bring it into schools, and also I was on a committee to bring it into what then polytechnics still, and then into universities. And you know, we spent a lot of time in these committees. And when the reports were produced, the Department for Education simply would not allow it. And our report into universities and how to get it, you know, early decolonising the curriculum, and this was 1987. The DS official went through our report and crossed out the word anti-racist every time that we put it in. It was just not allowed. In 1987, actually, I must read you this bit from Margaret Thatcher, because obviously Mrs. Thatcher was very much against any teaching of this nature. Here we are at the 1987 Conservative Party conference. Opportunity is being snatched away from young people by hard left education authorities and extremist teachers. Children will need to be able to learn to count and multiply, or learning anti-racist mathematics, whatever that might be. Yes. Children will need to express themselves in clear English, being taught political slogans. Sorry.
I didn't say it, Sally.
Yeah, so she was appalled at that, and she was particularly appalled at the history curriculum. Yep, okay. Although not a historian myself, at least that's something, I have a clear account of what history is. History is an account of what happened in the past. So, who needs anything else, you know, when we all know what history is. Okay, so the 90s wasn't much better. John Major also was very much against teaching. He got gender into it. We shouldn't be teaching issues of race and gender, even though his politicians, if you remember the 90s, I don't know if anyone does, it was disgraceful episodes of his politicians all having affairs and so on, you know. And then we got Tony Blair, and Tony Blair said, right, you know, we are going to have some changes, but no, not a lot happened. As soon as there were more riots, urban disturbances, in 2001, this time it was people in northern English towns, Pakistani Indian origin, mainly Pakistani origin, Bangladeshi origin. Once we had more riots in 2001, Blair turned back again. And so again, we had clamping down on what was going on in school. And then from then on, it was really all downhill, wasn't it? You know, even, you know, Gordon Brown, who became well known in the 2010 election, leaving his microphone on, you know, after he'd been talking to one of his constituents, and said, well, no, he was canvassing, and he said, oh, I've just been talking, who told me to go to that bigoted woman? And of course, it was broadcast, it was on air, you know, so here was Gordon Brown, who actually is quite a nice guy, you know, was talking about a bigoted woman because she was objecting to migration and so on. So Labour, you know, was also standing back. And then from then on, again, all downhill. It's been quite a struggle. And the Conservatives reckoned they had a philosopher behind it. There was a guy called Roger Scruton. Anybody know Roger Scruton? Who's doing philosophy? Anybody? Okay. And Roger Scruton, who died a couple of years ago, he was a big Conservative philosopher. He was viciously against any teaching that might be anti-racist. And he was, even when he died, Boris Johnson made a speech saying he was one of our great Conservative thinkers. No, he wasn't. You know, he edited a magazine in the 80s called the Salisbury Review, and I had some real ding-dongs with Roger Scruton. So, you know, they reckon they have a sort of philosophy, anti-racist. And of course now, what probably if I go to this thing tomorrow, we will just get, you know, wokery. Oh, anything that you say is woke, you know, you're woke. And it's sort of, we need to take it seriously, because teachers, as Michelle was saying, are desperate now, aren't they, to actually do the right thing for children. Children and young people themselves are actually asking for change, but our politicians and our policymakers, and of course local authorities used to have advisors and so on, they don't have the money for that now. We've really got to get a philosophy behind it and actually get some political action, I think, that will actually begin to change this to support teachers. Thank you.
Yeah, so if you could join me in thanking hugely Jason, Michelle and Sally for tonight's introduction to the topic, which I think has given us a lot of food for thought, and particularly with Sally's taking us through history from the 60s and Michelle's really persuasive argument that we all need to be political when we're in the classroom. We need to be questioning the concepts that we're teaching, and we really need to make sure that we are encouraging representation for our young people in our classrooms globally, wherever we are. And Jason setting the scene very nicely for the questioning that we need to be doing when we're talking about legacies, imperial legacies in race and education. So a huge thank you to the panel. I do hope you'll join us again next week. We've got Professor Robert Kildare from the Modern History faculty. I'm not pronouncing that correctly. He is talking, I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses with me. Empires of the Mind, How Empire is Still With Us in the 21st Century. Chair is Natasha Robinson, and we have an interlocutor with Kane Turner, who's a doctoral student in the history faculty and Race and Resistance co-convener. So I think that's going to be really interesting next week. As Jason said, opportunity for questions over a glass of wine in the cafe. Thanks, everyone.